Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in a 1960s airport terminal was different. It was thick with anticipation, with the scent of jet fuel and ambition. This was the dawn of a new age, the jet age, a time when the world was shrinking and the possibilities felt infinite. And striding through the polished concourse of LaGuardia, or Idlewild, a figure of impossible confidence would often appear. He was young, impossibly young, but he wore the uniform of a Pan-American World Airways pilot, with an authority that belied his years. Crisp navy blue, gold wings gleaming on his chest, a commander's cap tilted just so. He was handsome, charming, with a smile that could disarm the most skeptical ticket agent, and a gaze that seemed to hold the secrets of the skies. To the flight crews who greeted him, he was First Officer Frank Williams, a man living the dream. He was a knight of the modern era, a trusted custodian of a hundredton machine that defied gravity and stitched continents together. But he was a ghost. The uniform was a costume. The name was an alias. The confidence was a shield. The man inside, Frank William Abagnale Jr., was not a pilot. He had never formally studied aviation, never logged an hour in a flight simulator, let alone the cockpit of a Boeing 707. He was a teenager, a runaway from a broken home in the Bronx, armed with nothing more than a preternatural gift for observation and utter lack of fear, and a profound understanding of a simple, universal truth, that most people see what they expect to see. They see the uniform, not the man. They see the confidence, not the deception. For 2 years, this phantom pilot would fly over 1 million miles, visit dozens of countries, and live a life of glamour and adventure, all on the payroll of an airline that had no idea he even existed, and it was only the beginning. Welcome to Anatomy of Crime. Today, we are not dissecting a murder or a heist in the traditional sense. Instead, we are exploring one of the most audacious and bewildering criminal careers of the 20th century. We will dissect the anatomy of a master imposter. This isn't just a story about fake checks and clever disguises. It is an inquiry into the nature of identity itself, into the psychology of the con artist, and the gullibility of the systems they exploit. But more than that, it is an examination of a legend so powerful, so compelling, that it may well be Frank Abagnale's single greatest creation, a con that has lasted for over 50 years. We will unravel the methods behind his impersonations of a pilot, a doctor, and a lawyer, but we will also confront the uncomfortable questions about the story itself, separating the documented facts from the dazzling fiction. To understand Frank Abagnale, we must understand both the crimes he committed and the myth he so brilliantly constructed in their wake. The story of Frank Abagnale Jr. begins not in the sky, but in a comfortable, aspirational home in New Rochelle, New York. Born in 1948, he was the third of 4 children, and the beloved son of his father, Frank Abagnale Sr., and his French mother, Paulette. To the young Frank, his father was a giant. Frank Sr. was a successful local businessman, a respected figure in the community, and a man who understood the power of presentation. He taught his son that appearance was paramount, that the suit you wore and the car you drove often mattered more than the money you had in the bank. Frank Sr. was a man of immense charm and a fixture in local Republican politics, a man who seemed to have the world on a string. It was an intoxicating lesson for a young, impressionable boy. Project success, and success will follow. But beneath the polished surface, the foundation of the Abagnale household was cracking. Frank Sr.'s business ventures became increasingly precarious, and he was soon mired in tax disputes with the IRS that would ultimately ruin him financially. The glamour began to fade, replaced by a quiet desperation. The strain tore at his parents' marriage, culminating in a devastating divorce when Frank Jr. was just 16. A judge asked the boy to choose which parent he would live with. Overwhelmed and heartbroken, Frank couldn't answer. He did the only thing he could think of. He ran. He ran out of the courtroom, and in a way he would keep running for the next 5 years. This moment was the crucible. The stable, respectable world he had known had revealed itself to be a fragile illusion. The lesson he seemed to take from this was not one of tragedy, but of strategy. If life was a performance, he would no longer be a spectator. He would be the star of his own show. His first forays into crime were almost pathetically juvenile, yet they contained the seeds of his future genius. Alone in New York City, with little money and no prospects, he began altering his driver's license, adding a decade to his age to get better jobs. It was a simple trick, but it taught him that a piece of paper, a document, could rewrite reality. His first significant con was born of this newfound power. He realized that his father had given him a gas credit card and a list of authorized service stations. Frank Jr. devised a scheme. He would go to a station, charge a set of new tires or a battery, but instead of taking the merchandise, he would convince the attendant to give him a portion of the sale in cash. The attendant got a guaranteed sale and a small kickback, and Frank got pocket money. It was brilliant in its simplicity, a victimless crime in his mind. But when his father eventually got the bill for thousands of dollars, the scheme collapsed. There were no harsh repercussions, but a line had been crossed. Frank had discovered a talent for manipulating systems and persuading people to bend the rules. The next evolution was check fraud. In the 1960s, the banking system was a world of paper and trust. Checks took days, sometimes weeks, to clear, creating a window of opportunity known as the float. Frank began by simply overdrawing his own meager bank account. He would write checks for more money than he had, cash them, and be gone long before the bank realized the account was empty. He quickly grew more sophisticated. He learned about the magnetic ink characters at the bottom of a check, the routing numbers that directed the paper through the clearinghouse system. He realized he could get his hands on blank checks, print his own account number on them, and then alter the routing numbers with a simple paste-up job. He would send the checks to a bank in Phoenix while he cashed them in New York. The physical checks would be misdirected across the country, buying him precious extra days, even weeks, before his fraud was discovered. He was no longer just exploiting a loophole. He was reverse engineering the system itself. He was learning its language, its rhythms, and its weaknesses. But writing small, fraudulent checks was a grind. It was a life lived in the shadows. He craved something more. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted respect. He wanted to step out of the shadows and into the light. He just needed the right costume. One day, standing on a street corner in New York, he saw a group of pilots and flight attendants emerge from a hotel, laughing and heading for an airport shuttle. They were figures of glamour, of authority. They moved through the world with an effortless grace. No one would ever question a pilot. A bank teller would never second-guess a check from a Pan Am pilot. A hotel clerk would never ask for a deposit. The uniform, he realized, was the ultimate key. It was a passport to a world of instant credibility. The decision was made. He would become one of them. The challenge, of course, was immense. How does a teenage runaway, with no credentials and no experience, convincingly impersonate a pilot for one of the world's most prestigious airlines? His approach was a masterclass in social engineering. He didn't try to enroll in flight school or forge a pilot's license from scratch. He started with a simple phone call. He called Pan Am's corporate headquarters. Posing as a pilot who had lost his uniform, he navigated the phone tree with practiced ease, eventually reaching the purchasing department. He explained his predicament and asked where he could acquire a replacement. The helpful employee gave him the name and address of the airline's official supplier. One problem solved. Next, he needed an ID. He called Pan Am again, this time claiming to be a student from a local high school doing a report on the airline's operations. He scheduled an interview with a public relations officer. During their meeting, he charmed the man with his enthusiasm and feigned naivete, all the while carefully observing the design and details of employee ID cards. He obtained a blank card from a specialty printing shop and, using press and letters, meticulously recreated the Pan Am identification. The final piece was the Federal Aviation Administration pilot's license. For this, he turned to the ultimate source, a real pilot. He befriended a pilot, expressing a passionate interest in aviation, and asked to see his license, claiming he wanted to use it as a model for an ID for his own flying club. The pilot, flattered and unsuspecting, obliged. Frank now had a perfect template. He was no longer Frank Abagnale, the teenage runaway. He was Frank Williams, first officer, Pan American World Airways. The persona of Frank Williams was his most elaborate and enduring creation. It was a role he inhabited for 2 years, and it's the period that forms the core of his legend. According to his own telling, as immortalized in his book and the subsequent film, his life as a pilot was a whirlwind of international adventure. His primary goal was not to fly planes, but to travel the world for free and enhance his check-cashing schemes. He learned about a practice called deadheading, where an airline pilot from one company could hitch a ride in the cockpit's jump seat of another airline's flight if space was available. Armed with his fake credentials, Abagnale claims he deadheaded on over 250 flights, traveling more than 1 million miles to 26 countries. He describes staying in luxury hotels, dining in the finest restaurants, and charming countless flight attendants, all while Pan Am footed the bill. He even recounts moments of sheer terror, like being offered the controls of a passenger jet at 30,000 feet by a trusting captain, and having to bluff his way out of it by claiming he had been drinking the night before and putting the plane on autopilot. It's a fantastic story. It paints a picture of a charming rogue, a boy genius, outsmarting a monolithic corporation. And for decades, this story was accepted as fact. However, recent investigative work, most notably by journalist Alan C. Logan, has unearthed evidence that casts serious doubt on the scale and scope of these claims. Logan's research into airline and public records from the era suggests that while Abagnale did successfully create the pilot persona and did use it to his advantage, the notion of him living as a full-time globe-trotting pilot for 2 years is a dramatic embellishment. The documented evidence of his whereabouts during this period often places him in the United States, deep in his check fraud operations. It seems more likely that the pilot uniform was primarily a tool to grant him instant credibility while cashing fraudulent checks. It was a brilliant prop that opened doors and allayed suspicion. The image of him in a bank lobby, in full Pan Am regalia, was far more convincing than that of any ordinary customer. So, while he may have managed to deadhead on some flights, the million-mile, 26-country adventure was likely part of the legend, not the reality. The truth, it seems, is still audacious, but far more grounded. He wasn't a phantom of the airways, but a master of the bank queue, using the romance of the sky as his ultimate disguise on the ground. The pilot uniform was a powerful tool, but Abagnale was keenly aware that any costume, if worn for too long, risks exposure. After a close call at a New Orleans airport where he was nearly questioned by FBI agents who were, in fact, waiting for a different suspect, he decided it was time for Frank Williams to retire. He shed his pilot's uniform and laid low, eventually settling in an apartment complex in Georgia. It was here that his next great impersonation was born. Not from a grand plan, but from a simple lie on a rental application. Wary of leaving his profession blank, he impulsively wrote, "medical doctor." The lie took on a life of its own when he was befriended by a legitimate doctor who also lived in the building. Fascinated by Abagnale's apparent background, the doctor invited him to visit the local hospital where he worked. Soon, he was being introduced around as Dr. Frank Connors. The hospital administration, perpetually short-staffed, offered him a position as a temporary resident supervisor. His primary duties, according to Abagnale, were administrative. He was to oversee a team of medical interns, handling paperwork and ensuring the shifts were covered. He insists he never practiced medicine, never made a medical decision, and never put a patient's life at risk. He claims he was able to maintain the charade by simply letting the interns handle all the actual medical work. When confronted with a case, he would defer to their judgment, masterfully playing the role of a hands-off manager who trusted his team. The most famous anecdote from this period involves a blue baby emergency where an infant was deprived of oxygen. Abagnale recounts being utterly clueless and frozen with fear as nurses and interns shouted medical jargon at him, until he realized, with profound relief, that they weren't asking him for instructions, but were simply informing him of the situation as they capably handled it themselves. This chapter of his life, like the pilot phase, is a testament to his ability to blend in and project competence. But again, the veracity of the details has been challenged. It's highly improbable that a major hospital, even in the 1960s, would hire a supervisor, even a temporary one, without a thorough check of credentials, licenses, and references. It's more plausible that his role was far less significant than he portrays. Perhaps a low-level administrative clerk or orderly position that he later embellished into a supervisory role for his narrative. The Dr. Connors persona showcases a core tenet of the master imposter. Find a position within a complex system where you can hide in plain sight, a role where responsibility is diffuse and actual expertise is rarely tested. He survived not by knowing medicine, but by knowing bureaucracy. His tenure as a doctor ended, he says, after nearly a year, when the constant fear of making a fatal mistake became too much to bear. He quietly resigned and moved on, leaving another ghost in his wake. From medicine, Abagnale made an even more audacious leap into the field of law. After leaving Georgia, he began dating a flight attendant who had a law degree from Harvard. When she spoke of her profession, he saw a new opportunity. He told her that he, too, was a Harvard law graduate, but had become disillusioned with the profession. This lie set the stage for his next act. He moved with her to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. To maintain his cover, he knew he would have to make a convincing show of seeking employment as a lawyer. He created a fake Harvard law transcript, a beautiful piece of forgery, and began applying to firms. To his astonishment, he found that the Louisiana Attorney General's office was desperately seeking lawyers. He was offered a job, pending one small detail: he had to pass the state bar exam. Here, the story takes a turn that seems almost impossible. Abagnale, with no legal training whatsoever, claims he prepared for the Louisiana bar exam by studying for just 8 weeks, and then passed it on his 3rd attempt. This is often presented as a sign of his towering genius. However, the context is critical. In the 1960s, the Louisiana bar exam was unique. Unlike other states, you could take the exam as many times as you wished. You were also told which sections you failed, so you could focus your studies for the next attempt. The exam was less a test of comprehensive legal knowledge and more a process of elimination. As Abagnale himself later admitted, it was a matter of eliminating what you got wrong. So, while passing the bar is an impressive feat under any circumstances, it was not the miracle of intellect he often portrays. It was, once again, the exploitation of a flawed system. He worked for the Attorney General's office for several months as Robert Black, Assistant Attorney General. His work, by his own account, was mundane. He describes it as being a gopher, fetching books and coffee for his boss. Far from the dramatic courtroom showdowns one might imagine, he was a small cog in a large legal machine. The charade ended when a genuinely trained colleague, a true Harvard graduate, began asking pointed questions about his time at the university. The questions were casual, but they were specific. About professors, campus traditions, and legal doctrines he couldn't possibly know. The walls were closing in. Before his background could be fully investigated, Frank Abagnale Jr., a.k.a. Robert Black, resigned and disappeared once more. The anatomy of his professional impersonations was now clear. Identify a system with a need, create a plausible entry point through forgery and charm, and then find a niche within that system that required minimal actual expertise, allowing him to survive on confidence and delegation alone. He wasn't pretending to be a surgeon. He was pretending to be a supervisor. He wasn't pretending to be a trial lawyer. He was pretending to be a legal researcher. He was a master of finding the cracks in the walls of institutional authority. While Abagnale was busy collecting titles, pilot, doctor, lawyer, a very real investigation was slowly but surely closing in on him. The driving force was not his fantastic impersonations, but his far more prosaic yet widespread check fraud. This was the crime that left a tangible paper trail, a trail that led directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The primary agent on his case, a man Abagnale would later immortalize and befriend, was FBI agent Joseph Shea. In the movie Catch Me If You Can, he is portrayed as Carl Hanratty, a dogged, almost obsessive investigator who becomes a reluctant father figure to the young conman. The reality was, as is often the case, more complex. Shea was just one of many agents working on a nationwide fraud case. But he was the one who began to piece together the scattered reports of a brilliant, elusive forger. The FBI's investigation focused on the mechanics of the fraud. They analyzed the forged checks, noting their sophistication. Abagnale was a pioneer. He was one of the first criminals to understand the importance of creating perfect replicas of legitimate checks. Down to the type of paper and the magnetic ink, he would go to a bank, open an account with a small cash deposit, and take a handful of blank starter checks. He would then use these as templates. He would acquire reams of the precise paper stock used by check printers, and using a large, sophisticated printing press, he could produce thousands of nearly perfect counterfeit payroll checks from companies like Pan Am or IBM. He would then recruit teams of young women, charmed by his good looks and apparent wealth, to cash these checks for him in various cities, taking a small cut for themselves. It was a sophisticated, distributed operation that netted him, by his own estimate over $2 million, a colossal sum in the 1960s. Realizing the net was tightening in the United States, Abagnale fled to Europe, hoping to continue his scams on a new continent. But his reputation had preceded him. Interpol had issued warrants for his arrest in multiple countries. The freewheeling life of the charming imposter was coming to an end. In 1969, at the age of 21, he was spotted and arrested by French police in Montpellier. An ex-girlfriend had recognized his face on a wanted poster. The capture itself was undramatic, a quiet arrest in a grocery store. The subsequent punishment, however, was brutal. He was sentenced to a year in the Perpignan prison, a medieval fortress with conditions that were notoriously horrific. He described being kept in a tiny, lightless, unheated stone cell, stripped naked, with only a bucket for a toilet. For 6 months, he endured this solitary, tortuous existence, a stark and brutal end to his life of manufactured glamour. After his sentence in France was served, he was extradited to Sweden, where he served another 6 months in a Malmö prison, an experience he described as comparatively humane and civil. Finally, he was extradited back to the United States to face federal charges for his years of fraud. It was during his return to American custody that two of the most dramatic and questionable events of his saga allegedly took place. The first is the legendary escape from the British VC-10 aircraft as it taxied on the runway at JFK Airport in New York. According to Abagnale, while being escorted from the plane, he learned from a stewardess that he was being taken directly to a federal detention center. Knowing he had to act fast, he used the lavatory. He managed to pry open the toilet housing, revealing the mechanics and wiring of the plane below. He slipped through the small opening, dropped onto the tarmac just as the plane neared the terminal gate, and sprinted away into the night, disappearing before the astonished eyes of his FBI escorts. It is a story worthy of James Bond, an act of impossible daring and ingenuity. It is also almost certainly a complete fabrication. Aviation experts and historians have stated unequivocally that such an escape is physically impossible from a commercial airliner, especially a VC-10. The gap between the toilet assembly and the fuselage is filled with pipes, wires, and structural supports, leaving no room for a person to pass through. The aircraft is also pressurized, making any such breach catastrophic. The story is pure theater, a brilliant addition to the growing Abagnale myth. The second alleged escape is more grounded in fact, though still embellished in the telling. While awaiting trial at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia, Abagnale noticed the lax security standards afforded to certain inmates. He learned that the U.S. Marshals accompanying him were forgetting to bring his detention commitment papers. Posing as an undercover prison inspector, a role he adopted with his usual flair, he convinced a guard that he was there to secretly investigate reports of security lapses. He used a business card of a real Bureau of Prisons inspector, which he had palmed and doctored, and had an outside female accomplice create a fake FBI agent ID for him. He cultivated a relationship with the guards over several weeks, complaining about the prison's supposed failings. Eventually, he simply told them he needed to speak with an FBI agent outside the prison walls. The guards, completely taken in, allowed him to walk right out the front door to a waiting car, which he believed was his FBI contact, but was in fact his accomplice. He was free for several weeks before being recaptured in Washington, D.C. This escape, unlike the airplane incident, did happen. It was a testament to his enduring powers of persuasion. but it was his last act of defiance. He was ultimately sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison for his crimes. Frank Abagnale served less than 5 years of his 12-year sentence. In 1974, he was granted parole on the condition that he would assist federal authorities. This marked the beginning of his great reinvention, the transition from Frank Abagnale, convicted felon, to Frank Abagnale, respected security consultant. This is perhaps his most successful and enduring impersonation. According to Abagnale, upon his release, he was immediately put to work by the FBI, lecturing at the academy and helping agents in the field understand the methods of forgers, counterfeiters, and imposters. He built a thriving business, Abagnale and Associates, based in Tulsa, Oklahoma, consulting for banks, corporations, and government agencies on fraud detection and prevention. He became a fixture on the lecture circuit, a semi-celebrity who appeared on television shows like The Tonight Show and To Tell the Truth. In 1980, he co-authored his autobiography, Catch Me If You Can, which cemented his legend and eventually became a blockbuster Steven Spielberg film. The redemption arc is a powerful narrative. The clever rogue who uses his illicit genius for good is a story we want to believe. And for decades, the world did believe it, unequivocally. But this part of the story has also come under intense scrutiny. While the FBI has acknowledged a handful of instances where Abagnale provided lectures or assistance, they have repeatedly and publicly refuted his claims of being a long-term embedded consultant who worked on active cases or traveled with agents. In 2002, around the time the movie was released, an FBI spokesperson stated clearly that his relationship was not as a special agent or operative, and that to suggest otherwise was an exaggeration. Journalists who have filed Freedom of Information Act requests have found little to no documentary evidence supporting his claims of extensive work for the Bureau. It appears that his work for the FBI, much like his tenure as a pilot, was a kernel of truth, a few lectures and consultations, that he expertly spun into a foundational element of his new, legitimate identity. This is the true anatomy of the master imposter. The con did not end with his arrest in 1969. It simply entered a new, more sophisticated phase. The product he was selling was no longer fake checks. It was his own life story. He had monetized his myth, and it was a brilliant business decision. He understood that society is far more interested in a tale of a dashing, globe-trotting teenage genius than the more mundane reality of a troubled kid from a broken home who was a prolific but ultimately conventional check forger. He gave the public a hero, an anti-hero they could root for. He wasn't violent. His victims were faceless, bureaucratic institutions like banks and airlines, which made his crimes feel victimless and clever. He was David against a series of Goliaths. And then he repented. He used his powers for good, reassuring us that even the most brilliant criminal could be brought back into the fold. It is a perfect self-contained narrative of crime, adventure, and redemption. The only problem is that a significant portion of it appears to be a carefully constructed fiction. Frank Abagnale's greatest trick wasn't impersonating a pilot. It was convincing the world he was the Frank Abagnale from the storybooks. So what are we left with when we dissect the life of Frank Abagnale Jr.? We are left with two distinct figures. There is the historical Frank Abagnale, a gifted and prolific forger who, from roughly age 16 to 21, engaged in a multi-state check fraud scheme. This young man was audacious, using a pilot's uniform as a prop to enhance his credibility, and he successfully escaped custody once through a clever ruse. He was arrested, served time in brutal and then humane prisons, and was paroled. This person is a documented reality. Then, there is the legendary Frank Abagnale, the creation. This is the charming prodigy, who flew millions of miles for Pan Am, who competently supervised doctors in a hospital, who passed the bar exam on a whim, who escaped from a moving jetliner, and who became the FBI's most trusted secret weapon in the war on fraud. This second figure is a masterpiece of storytelling, a character built on a foundation of truth, but embellished with decades of polished exaggeration and outright fabrication. The anatomy of this imposter, then, is a complex duality. The initial crimes themselves were built on a few key principles. First, an obsessive attention to detail, seen in his meticulous forgeries and his study of the pilot's persona. Second, an unshakable confidence, the ability to project absolute authority and belonging, even when he was terrified. Third, a deep understanding of systemic weaknesses. He didn't break down doors. He found the ones that were already unlocked. He knew that people are busy, that they follow procedures, and that they are predisposed to trust a person who looks the part. He exploited the gap between procedure and reality. But the anatomy of his second greater con, the creation of his own legend, is even more insightful. It relies on our collective desire for a good story. He understood that a compelling narrative is more powerful than a messy collection of facts. His story has heroes, villains, close calls, glamour, and a satisfying conclusion. It is perfectly structured. He sold this story to talk show hosts, to publishers, to Hollywood, and most importantly, to the public, and in doing so, he achieved a level of wealth and legitimacy that his check fraud schemes could never have provided. He became a living testament to his own central thesis. That appearance is reality. By repeatedly telling the world he was a brilliant, reformed master criminal, he became one. His true genius was not in the cons he committed in the 1960s, but in the grand, overarching con he has been performing ever since. He took a criminal record and transformed it into a brand. This is the ultimate anatomy of the imposter, the ability not just to create a false identity, but to merge it so completely with the truth that the two become indistinguishable, even perhaps to the man himself. The lingering question is not what Frank Abagnale did, but who he truly is. Is he the sum of his deceptions, or is the deception itself his most authentic act? We are drawn to his story, not just because of its audacity, but because it whispers a seductive truth about the world, that the lines defining our identity, our professions, and our capabilities are more fragile than we think. Frank Abagnale held a mirror up to the institutions of the 20th century and revealed them to be hollow, run by people all too willing to believe in a well-tailored suit and a confident smile. He showed that reality is, to a certain extent, negotiable. The enduring power of his legend proves that the most successful cons are not the ones we are tricked into believing, but the ones we choose to believe ourselves. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.